We are well aware that our network may not have the capacity to stay up to date and read current or relevant research to the work delivered in the community. And this is why these research events exist at Befriending Networks. This event was designed to bring the network together for just over an hour on Wednesday, the 16th of April, 2025, for an opportunity of peer learning during networking segments and for the opportunity to listen and learn from our researchers at Pro Bono Economics. The event aimed to provide opportunity to grow understanding, learn something new, listen, and hopefully participate in, reflecting on how this research relates to your project, your objectives, and evidencing the impact you are making on well-being. Please enjoy our recording of the fantastic presentation by Maliha and Jack of Pro Bono Economics.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm just going to share my screen now. But before that, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so as I go into share mode, if you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment box and I can take it up from there during our Q&A session. So thank you for having me here today, Victoria and the Befriending Network. I'm excited to present our report, which is Mind, Body, and Connection. It's a systematic review of low well-being in the UK in last year. And I think what I'm going to do in this presentation is walk us through what is well-being, why do we care about it, why it matters, can we attach a value to our well-being, and then have a slight look at it through the loneliness angle. Once I'm done with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Jack, who is going to go into a more in-depth discussion around loneliness. And I hope that's helpful for all of us here today. So to start off with, I'm going to ask us some questions for us to reflect on it. So to start off with, UK remains one of the richest countries in terms of, UK remains one of the richest countries in terms of gross domestic product. So GDP very broadly is the value of market activity. It's the monetary transactions that happen between different organizations or individuals. But oftentimes, and also historically, GDP calculation misses out activities that occur in the household, such as, childcare or preparing food, or even certain unpaid activities, such as caring for a loved one or even volunteering for a charity. And generally, these are not valued when we look at the calculation for GDP. But having said that, what does growth mean in practice? So does it reflect, does the calculation of GDP reflect what matters to you, what matters to me? For example, how we feel about the environment, how we feel about the climate around us, how we feel about certain things. Does the calculation of GDP investigate the most marginalized or vulnerable population? So for example, children that have special needs requirement, the LGBTQ plus community, single parents, the more marginalized and the more vulnerable. Does it take mental health into account? So how are we feeling on a day-to-day basis? What is it that affects our mental health on a day-to-day basis? And then does it consider whether someone is lonely? So how lonely do you feel? How self-isolated do you feel? And how that restricts your capacity or, to some extent, your well-being to do other activities around your life. And finally, having understood or having thought about these aspects, does it consider long-term implications? So for example, how our mental health affects our employment opportunities, how our mental health affects, the kind of job we take up or how we perform at the workplace, or for example, our health, our mortality. And I think that's the question that we need to be asking more now than before. especially post-pandemic, and how it has left certain people or everyone around us a disadvantage in certain ways, in certain situations. And again, these implications are not often considered or not often part of the GDP calculations that we take into account. So having said that, the question of the hour is, can we go beyond gross domestic product? So can we go beyond our calculation of GDP? So one of the starting points could be how we understand our well-being. So a standard definition of well-being that is used both in the literature, both in our national databases, is that well-being reflects how we are doing as individuals, communities, and as a nation, and how sustainable that is for the future. One of the ways we can understand well-being or we can measure well-being is done by the Office of National Statistics through their life satisfaction question. So over here, they ask a simple question in their survey rounds, which is overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? And this allows respondents to rate their life on a scale of 0 to 10. So higher levels indicating higher satisfaction, lower levels indicating lower satisfaction. And I think this is perhaps not a perfect measure to start off with, but it is starting to standardize our understanding of well-being. So now that we know that there is perhaps a way to measure well-being, can we put a value to our well-being? So how much we value this increase in life satisfaction for it to, for us to assign a value to it. So it is possible to attach a cash value to any recorded change in an individual's scores. So what we mean by that is when you ask an individual at one point and then you check what their score is at another point. A methodology that has been devised and used by the HM Treasury to assess the well-being impact and therefore the value for money. What this does is it considers how much someone would be willing to pay for 1 point improvement in well-being that lasts for a year. So it does sound a little bit complicated to begin with, but again, we explain that very elaborately in the report in the technical discussion of our calculation. But just to put it into perspective very simply, the Office of National Statistics question that we ask, you can think of it like, suppose someone was at, I'm just going to use a cursor so it's easy. So suppose someone was at 5 on a scale of 10, and they go to 6 on a scale of 10. So what that means is, according to the guidance, a 1 point improvement, so going from 5 to 6, is called a well-being improvement. And we only consider it to be an improvement if it is sustained for a year. So what I'm introducing here is the concept of longitudinal data. So as we collect more and more information on people's state of well-being, we are able to understand how that has changed over time. And as you know, well-being is not a static situation or a scenario. It is constantly evolving, constantly changing, and it affects our life expectations, our life situations. So at some point, you could have very high levels of well-being, but it's something could happen in that year which causes your well-being to go down. So for it to be an actual increase in your well-being, we need to see this sustained for a year. So what this means is that when someone moves from 5 to a 6 and sustained for a year, we call it one well-being improvement. And we can assign a value to this one well-being improvement. There is a very elaborate methodology explanation set out in the HM Treasury Green Book. So, it's worth having a look at that. And what that Green Book has done, it assigns a high value, a median value, and a low value. And what they do is the government adjusts it for every year to match current prices. Because, as we go from 2021 to 2022, prices change, inflation changes, so it adapts to that. It's also worth mentioning that this value that we attach to it, it's the willingness of the individual to pay for this increased well-being. So in layman terms, how willing are you, what is your value that you put on your willingness to achieve this 1 point increase in your well-being? And oftentimes people mistaken it to think that it's money that goes in your pocket or money that goes inside the government or is saving to the government. But it's more like it does not represent a direct financial gain, but instead it serves as a measurement of how much an improvement on the life satisfaction is valued by this individual. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, that this is a starting point. It may not be perfect, but as we use it more and more, it gives or generates evidence for its refinement. And one thing that we mentioned in the report, which is very interesting and again worth having a read, is that if we take this approach, the estimated cash benefit to an overnight of halving the number of adults who are lonely is about 54 billion of benefits to the government or to the society. So having said that, let's look at some statistics around the state of low well-being in the UK. So just a while ago, I explained about the life satisfaction scale. So using that measure and using our survey sources from the annual population survey and the ONS population data, in 2023, 3.2 million adults are living in low well-being. And this also translates that 3.2 million adults have rated less than 4 on a scale of 10 on the life satisfaction scale. This has been at its highest since 2018. So if you think about between 2018 to 2024 or 2023, end of 2023, this is an increase of 135,000 people every year that are adding to the stock of low well-being. Children and young people are also affected. OECD ranks UK 58 out of 73 countries for low life satisfaction among 15-year-olds. Again, there's a case for more data, more evidence around to understand what are the causes for this, what are the factors for this. And one other thing that we find is there's high persistence. So 1 in 100 adults are stuck in the state of low well-being for 4 consecutive years. So if you find yourself to go below 1 point in the life satisfaction scale, you're more likely to stay there for 4 consecutive years. Chronic loneliness is on the rise. So 5 billion adults are affected in this annual 1-year study. And loneliness affects young people. So children and young people are one of the most disproportionately affected groups. One reasoning could be is that oftentimes children may not be able to, put it into words, whether they feel lonely, whether they feel detached, how they feel at school. So they tend to be most disproportionately affected as well. The other thing now that I want to move into is about the vicious cycle around loneliness and well-being. And you will find that when my colleague Jack presents more on this. But how do we understand how loneliness erodes well-being? So chronic loneliness is both a cause and a consequence of low well-being. This has been mentioned in the literature several times, and I think what do we mean by that? In a sense that it's a cause and also a consequence of low well-being. So it's a cause because if you are lonely or you feel lonely, you're less likely to feel overall good about your life. You might find it more difficult to adapt to your life or take on certain life activities. Similarly, if you have low levels of well-being from other factors, you're also less likely to interact with your community, your surrounding, and that could make you feel even more isolated and more lonely. It's linked to depression, anxiety, and even higher mortality. I'm sure perhaps even in your study setups, you come across people, there's a link in that. But it can also have some indirect effect, which is like it can lead to withdrawal from community, from your work, and can also, take part in worsening exclusion. So if you're already feeling excluded, you can tend to feel even more if you're affected by loneliness or even low levels of well-being. Disproportionately, people are affected. So it's not necessarily linear, or we cannot say on an average, although we can. But when you break down the sample into a different sample population, you find that young people, unemployed, older people, women, and those with long-term health conditions are especially vulnerable. And, there's a case that's being built against that, built for that the data suggests that addressing loneliness could be a powerful lever for improving well-being and designing interventions or looking at interventions. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm now going to pass it on to Jack to go further into the discussion around loneliness.
Perfect timing. I am not going to guarantee that my timing will be perfect based on my history of presentations. Thanks, Maliha. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Jack. I'm a senior researcher at PBE. Just to give you a bit of background into, a bit of an explanation of what I'm going to talk about. So, obviously, Maliha's just talked through our report on low well-being, and in part of the research or part of the process of that research, we really wanted to identify what were the main drivers, the main causes of low well-being, and through that we identified that actually loneliness was one of the biggest causes of low well-being in the UK. What that has led us to do as an organisation is to start a research programme about loneliness, because we're an organisation that's focused on low well-being. Theoretically, if you can help to tackle loneliness, you can help to tackle low well-being. So what we've been doing, Maliha and I have been doing a very quick sort of rapid evidence review around loneliness. And what I would like to do, if possible, is to get a bit of a sense check on what we found, given that you guys are experts in working with people who are lonely or delivering interventions, have got a lot of experience in this field. I'm aware that I'm essentially a bit of an amateur who's read a lot of academic reports. So I would be really grateful if I could absorb some of your expertise, knowledge, skepticism, cynicism potentially about academic research in this field, but also if there are things that maybe you think I've missed or I've completely misunderstood, then to get a bit of a correction from you would be really helpful. So that's my setup, really. I'm going to quickly get my slides ready and hope that works. That looks like that's working to me.
Perfect.
Yeah, is that all right? Thanks,
yep.
Victoria. So, as I said, a bit of a sense check and to get your reflections would be really, really helpful for me. So, in doing our evidence review, we've sort of identified 7 key themes. Okay, so within the literature, we find literature that talks about how we define loneliness, how we measure it, how prevalent it is, and what parts of the population or what population groups are more or less affected. What are the drivers or the causes or the risk factors? What impact does it have on people and society? What interventions there are, and also sort of an exploration of the main policy interventions or the main policy approaches. I'm not going to talk about policy so much today because I think it's less interesting, if I'm honest. So I'm going to go through each of these 7 really and just say what I found or what I've understood. And then, as I've said, if you have thoughts, reflections, or ideas about any of these, or you sort of through your lens, through your experience, have different takes on them, I'd be really fascinated to find out a bit more, basically. So I think what I found, which is interesting, because this is rarely the case, is actually quite a broad agreement about how we define loneliness. And that's in this top blue box here. So interesting to note, I think, is that it's universally defined as a subjective feeling. So it's subjective to the individual as to whether they are lonely or not. And that obviously differentiates it from social isolation, which can be more objectively considered. But it's about this mismatch between the sort of quantity, and I would probably say quantity and or quality of social relationships that we have and those that we want. So this is a key thing that comes through again and again. It's this mismatch between desired and actual state. But what I find is there's a sort of inconsistency around this concept of chronic loneliness. And again, like I think even a bit of there's even a bit of uncertainty around the term chronic loneliness. How useful, how effective is it? An over medicalizing term? I think there's a lot of discussion around that. But predominantly, people talk about chronic loneliness as a combination of these three dimensions: the frequency, so how often do people feel lonely; the duration, so how long do those feelings last, or does that perception last; and then the intensity of loneliness. So, how strongly do those feelings, or does that perception affect the individual? But there's no consistent definition of how these dimensions are combined to define chronic loneliness, which I think is slightly problematic, because what you have is a lot of studies, a lot of research, and potentially interventions that are talking about addressing chronic loneliness, but not really anyone working to the same definition of what that is. So how long do you have to feel lonely? How often do you have to feel lonely for it to be chronic? How long does that have to last to be chronic? How strong do those feelings have to be for it to be defined as chronic? It's all quite inconsistent, I would say. In terms of measurement, and this slightly, as Maliha talked about how we measure well-being, obviously a lot of attempts to understand, measure, and intervene in terms of loneliness come from survey measurement. Okay, so lots of surveys undertaken by the ONS will use standard questions around loneliness to try and get a sense of how prevalent it is and who is affected. So what I would flag here is that this is predominantly based on surveys undertaken in England. Because loneliness is a devolved matter, the surveys that happen in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland to a certain extent, they all have different questions and use different measures. But this is the sort of what ONS recommends as the gold standard approach to measuring loneliness in England. So it involves both what's called direct questions and indirect questions. So obviously the dark blue being the direct question, simply asking people how often they feel lonely, and then giving them a set of response options which run from never to often or always. And what that enables you to do, I guess, is to measure essentially the frequency of loneliness. And then you have these indirect questions as well. So how often do you feel that you lack companionship, left out, isolated, and then a 3-point scale for response. And you do tend to get slightly different results if you're looking at indirect and direct measures, but generally you get the same patterns but slightly different proportions. I think what it shows is that people are more likely to identify themselves as lonely by the indirect rather than the direct question, and that probably speaks to some of the sort of social stigma issues around talking about, or even recognizing, or even the ability as an individual to recognize loneliness, because it's a complex concept, right? And what has also been done in terms of measurement is that, similar to the way that a cost value has been applied to affecting people's well-being, there's also a sort of government approved report which puts a cost value on reducing loneliness. So that's the kind of, if you move someone from very high frequency, very chronic loneliness down to a sort of more mild loneliness, a cost value can be attached to that. Obviously, there is challenges around putting a cost value, but this is more around how government is able to do cost benefit analysis and understand the best ways of spending public money, essentially. But so we can measure it in terms of through surveys, but also then when we have those measurements, we can attach a cost value to that. In terms of prevalence in populations, what we find in England is that it has increased in recent years. So 7% of adults in England in the most recent Community Life survey, which ran 23-24. So 7% of adults in England said that they were often or always lonely, and that equates to about 3.1 million people. And this was about 7% is up 2 percentage points. So in the 2013-14 Community Life survey, 5% of people. So a definite increase in loneliness. And as I said earlier, if you use the indirect questions, actually 10% of people. And there's a bit of complication around that. I won't go into that. But essentially, it seems like people are more likely to indirectly identify themselves as lonely rather than directly, which sort of makes sense to me and a sort of very layman's perspective. there's a, there's not an entire, it's not entirely unified in terms of understanding which population groups are most affected. So some studies find that loneliness is more prevalent among women. Some studies have found that it's more prevalent among men. Some people would hypothesize that men are less likely to admit it or acknowledge loneliness than women, but I'm not entirely sure how much that is proven. But again, feels logical to me. I think it's a fairly new, in terms of academic areas of study, it's fairly new loneliness. I think there's a lot of momentum has built up in perhaps the past 2 decades. Certainly earlier on, there was a traditional focus on loneliness among older people, but I think it's becoming increasingly established that actually loneliness decreases with age, and actually it's younger people who are most, or it's more, you're more likely to admit being lonely or to identify as being lonely if you're younger. What is fairly well established, I would say, is that certain groups tend to be at higher risk of loneliness than others. So we find that disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, long-term unemployment, levels of deprivation, physical and mental health, and relationship status, depending on where you fall within those sort of demographics, you are more likely to be at risk of loneliness. And there's, interestingly, so the most recent Community Life Survey was the first time that they've been able to do a really sort of detailed local authority level and regional level analysis. And there was I found, looking at it, there's quite a clear north-south divide. So in England, again, apologies to colleagues in Wales and Scotland, but in England, the southeast, southwest, the east, London, lower levels of average loneliness than in the north. And again, slightly surprising to me was that higher levels of loneliness in urban areas rather than rural areas. So you have this bunch of demographic, economic, health, geographic, and social drivers, seemingly. So much of what I've just described in terms of prevalence and populations is reflected in the literature around drivers and risk factors. So we sort of see a whole bunch of things that are identified in the academic literature as being sort of either causes or factors that put people at elevated risk of being lonely. So, but it's really difficult to prove causality, and a lot of it is self-reinforcing. And I think that's probably a big issue within the evidence base at the moment, is we don't really know the mechanisms of how these things work. And I think, and that just because that's really, really difficult to do, right? Because a lot of it's self-reinforcing and stuff. But a lot of things intersect. But yeah, it seems to be, individual characteristics, as just discussed, will have a big effect on risk of loneliness. The place that you live, so that's both the physical built environment, the availability of social infrastructure, levels of deprivation, and then social and community factors. So a lot of this is around how people feel about their community, sense of belonging, trust in others, etc. Particularly interesting sort of thread or a stream of research around how social experiences in younger life affect loneliness in later life. So it seems to be clustering around ideas of, the quality of your peer relationships in adolescence, being a victim of bullying, the nature of your familial relationships, being exposed to conflict with and between parents, and the fragility of social networks in younger life. If those things are, they can lead to loneliness in later life. But also that recognition that there are certain triggers or specific life events that can cause people to be lonely. So these are, typically things like bereavement, parenthood, onset of a health condition or onset of a disability, or being made unemployed can have sort of immediate effects on loneliness. I think there's a sort of maturity within the literature that's starting to recognize that you can't just look at individual risk factors in individual people at individual points in time. And there seems to be more of a focus on longitudinal study now, so tracking people over time to understand actually how an accumulation of these things over a person's lifetime, and then their exposure to these brought to these a bunch of these risk factors at a specific point in time can be the thing that makes them more vulnerable to loneliness. So I think that's interesting because it makes us step away from looking at the causes of loneliness as emanating from the individual and combining both individual and social causes. So, what's someone's life been like? What's their life like now? What their experience has been? What are the trigger or life events happening to that person? But also, what kind of resources can they draw on, both social but also economic, to be able to sort of weather that storm, as opposed to others who would have less of who would have be slightly more vulnerable. So I think this again is really complex, but something that I find really fascinating is this idea of you have to look at the whole person across the whole of their life to understand what's going on with that person, and also think about their broader socio-economic environment as well. And I think doing that leads to better policy and better interventions. Also, interestingly, there's a couple of theories around actually some of these things differ with age. So certain things become more or less important as we age, and they therefore have a greater impact. So bullying is more impactful on loneliness if we experience it in adolescence. Bereavement, or the loss of a spouse or partner particularly, is more impactful if it happens in earlier adulthood than if it happens in later adulthood. Again, I think a lot of these are sort of untested theories or hypotheses, but to me, they're quite compelling and quite interesting. So, evidence on impact. So what are the consequences of loneliness? What's the impact? So most of it actually, and I think this has probably been the reason why it became such a focused on in terms of policy, is that evidence started to develop about its health and economic impact. So we started to establish through research and academic evidence of loneliness being a huge public health matter, essentially, and for some as severe a threat to public health as smoking and obesity. And this is because there was a whole bunch of evidence that said, you are at increased mortality risk, increased risk of heart disease, dementia, worse sleep, stress, mental health conditions. And what that can lead to, but also what it can also is, so that can have economic impact as well. So greater use of health services, lower levels of productivity. We've talked about lower levels of well-being already, but particularly in younger people, poor academic performance, which would then lead to, over their lifetime, lower levels of pay, essentially, working in lower paid jobs because of lower levels of academic performance, in part driven by loneliness, and risk of unemployment as well. So I think there's more that can be done in terms of understanding where else there are impacts. But this is certainly, I think, the thing that gave it the push into government really focusing on it, because they could start to understand how it impacted on public health and subsequent economic consequences. In terms of interventions, there's fairly strong sort of randomized control trial evidence around certain interventions that are effective, but obviously that they tend to focus on general population, and actually I think there's a recognition that these things don't work for all groups or all people. I think that touches a little bit on what I was talking about before about considering the whole person and the whole of their life and what they've got around them in terms of how things work. But certainly psychological treatment, social support interventions, and social and emotional skills training were seen as sort of fairly well evidenced effective interventions. But I would say, again, that is very focused on the individual, and I have a sense that there's a sort of insufficient focusing on addressing sort of wider social or risk factors. And I think ultimately, if you want to have a big impact on loneliness, it's more about how do you address those underlying social risk factors, as opposed to doing lots of interventions on people once they've become lonely or are at elevated risk of loneliness. That covers everything that I will, yeah, that covers everything that I have learned, and I'd be fascinated to get other people's reflections on what I've said, but also obviously questions, etc., on Maliha's. Victoria, I'm going to hand back to you. Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Jack. You both touched on some really interesting points. I saw quite a few people nodding along. Malia, as you said about cause and consequence, I saw a few people being like, "Yep," but also quite interesting. But when we talked about the quantity and quality of relationships and that impact, and I do like, Jack, that you ended with a nice little shout out with social support because that is what befriending is. So it's nice to know that we are a good intervention, everyone that's online today. So you're going to be popped back into breakout rooms for 10 minutes with the discussion of how can you apply this research into the work that you do, but also just to discuss it in general, and also consider Jack's request of whether it seemed relevant to what you are witnessing in your project. So your 10 minutes start now. This time without the co-host. So you stay in the main room. You'll stay here. There we go. I'll catch up on the chat. And I'll Okay, welcome back, everyone. Again, hope you had a nice discussion there in your smaller group, so hopefully able to dive into things a bit more. We're going to start with the first question that came in. So, Rahima, you asked a question, and Malia is prepared to answer this one. So, over to you.
Hi, Rahima. Thanks very much for your question. It's, of course, an interesting one, and certainly not, one that we haven't heard before because of the methodology and, how it's there, it's still developing. So to start off with, I'm just going to clarify that a change from a well-being score of 5 to 6 is always a 1 point change, no matter what year it is. So it does not change with prices. But the pound value of that change, so what individuals are willing to pay for that increase, that is adjusted to reflect today's economy, but not the satisfaction score themselves. So I'm just going to spend a little bit more context here. So think of the life satisfaction scores that go from 0 to 10. They are always based on how people feel, which is subjective. We all know that, right? Like there is no correct or no specific way to say this is happiness or this is how, we have high levels of well-being or low levels of well-being. So it's very subjective. But the aim of this, HM Treasury Green Book method is that when economists or even policymakers, when they want to estimate the economic benefit of improving someone's well-being, so for example, maybe you are running an intervention where you take your baseline score of life satisfaction, and then when you're done giving the program, you take an end-line score of your life satisfaction. So if you want to look at the change of your intervention, or the economic benefit of improving someone's well-being, you translate those improvements into money terms using what's called the well-being valuation method. Now, because this is subjective, because we cannot say for sure that this is exactly how someone feels or this is exactly how we define happiness or satisfaction, the method assigns a low value, a medium value, and a high value of well-being. What that does is these ranges help us to account for uncertainty, since well-being is personal and hard to measure. So when we take that increase in value, we can do sensitivity checks to see if someone values it at low well-being, what's the economic benefit? If someone values it at high, what's the economic benefit? And so on. And policymakers, economists, they use this range to test how much a policy might be worth under different assumptions. So these money values are adjusted for inflation so that they're expressed in today's money. I can give you a simple example. So, for example, a 1 point increase in a life satisfaction is worth £13,000 in 2016 prices. To use that value in today's economic context, you just adjust for inflation and express it in 2023 prices. So maybe that now equates to 15,347. So I hope I was able to give you like a short, brief picture. But again, I think Victoria has directed all of us to the Green Book, and it's worth going through that. And also happy to answer any clarifying questions via email if helpful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And yes, yeah, I've added the green book to the delegate pack. Has anyone else got any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. Or are we all just digesting everything that we've heard? Jane, over to you.
Just a quick one. I wondered if during your research, did you find, I know that there's a paucity of longitudinal studies, but is there any evidence that shows that lonely young people go on to be lonely old people? Do we think that that's, I mean, if loneliness is affected by your life chances and your ability to change and adapt, do we know yet if that happens?
So I think it's a good question, and I think the answer is yes. So I think loneliness in younger life is a predictor of loneliness in later life.
Which
Although
I
I think
guess is, sorry, yeah,
no,
which could go on to be a big problem then if we know that they're the loneliest group.
yes, I can't be 100% sure that the evidence is particularly strong. I think younger loneliness in younger people is probably under researched because I think, as again, like most of the focus has been on traditionally on older people and loneliness. And I think a lot of the focus on younger people is more a focus on not so much whether they're lonely, but the quality of their peer relationships. A lot of it is around victimization and bullying leading to loneliness, as opposed to loneliness leading to loneliness.
Right. Okay.
But I think we can sort of logically draw a line between victimization in younger life or bullying, being lonely in younger life, and therefore being like more likely of being lonely in older life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think logically that works. Sorry, Jane, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I recently gave a presentation to some scouts, and we looked at the similarities of loneliness across the age. And this was to do with them wanting to do a project to do with loneliness. And when I showed them that actually younger people were lonelier by far now in terms of in relationship to older people, they still didn't really want to recognize loneliness in their peer group. They wanted to tackle loneliness in older people. So I think there is very much this thing, even in younger people, that if you're old, you must be lonely, and that's where they wanted to focus their efforts. And I thought that was really interesting that they weren't actually, they kind of maybe talk about it differently at that age. They don't want to talk about it as loneliness. And we were talking in our group, I mean, do you want to be part of a club that, for lonely people anyway, you want to be part of something that kind of inspires you, not just because you're lonely.
I one thing I've been thinking about this is I think it's interesting to consider the strength of those feelings at that age. So, it is quite difficult being an adolescent. It's quite, anxiety inducing. There's a lot of emotion. And I wonder how much of that high levels of reported loneliness in that cohort, how much of that leads to like sustained and chronic, for want of a better phrase, right? And how much of it actually sort of goes away fairly quickly in that cohort once you sort of mature a bit emotionally and you become a bit more stable and your relationships become more stable and you're not in an environment like a school, which is really conducive often to that quite I don't know, quite challenging sort of social interaction or social environment. So it's like, is it a natural consequence of being young, or is it a sort of artificial consequence of the environment in which young people are existing, i.e. in schools or in education institutes?
That's a deep question, Jack.
But
I know,
right,
I think
totally. But like, I think that's, for me, is like a really interesting thing to understand because, as someone mentioned in the chat, like it's harder for older people to get out of loneliness. I think that was someone's point in the chat, right? And actually, is it a case that it's actually more young people do feel lonely, but it's actually quite it's easier for them to resolve that. I don't really know, but again, just interesting questions, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's also
sorry.
No, I was just going to say very quickly, I think it's part of that question about whether we should be calling everything loneliness and sort of identifying, because it can be adaptive. So thank you. Sorry, go
No,
ahead.
you're grand. I just say we are officially at 10 past 11, but and I do see your question on the interventions like collecting data before and after. And I don't think there's a simple answer, but I would promote it. But what I will for just now, we can obviously I'm quite happy to stay online with people, but I am aware that people might need to get away. So I just want to highlight our evaluation form for today. So I've put the link in the chat, but also the QR code is on the screen for those of you that want to scan. It's also on your delegate pack. As I say, it's the first research day of 2025. We try to do 4 a year. So please do give your input on future topics and things. And also be aware of what is just around the corner. We have different events happening across May and June. These aren't all of them, these are just some of them. But if anyone wants to continue the conversation of well-being, we have our supporting mental well-being training course on Tuesday next week. We also have Nicola hosting an out of hours networking for those of you that do not have the capacity during the working day, as well as a mixture of other things, including our next research event, which is on intergenerational work in May. And also, we are hosting events for volunteers in June for Volunteers Week, if you haven't already seen these, as well as our digital masterclasses to help all of you get confident using things like Padlet, which our delegate pack is hosted on. But for now, I would just like to say a massive thank you to Jack and Maliha. Thank you so much for your time today and your presentation. It's been greatly appreciated. And like we said, we will add the slides to your delegate pack as well as a recording for anyone that wants to go back and re-listen or share with a colleague that couldn't make it today. But yeah, thank you everyone. I will stay on last in case anyone does want to hang about and discuss. But otherwise, session dismissed. Have a good day, everybody. And hopefully we'll host you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you
Thank
all.
you, everyone. Nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.